David Parsons is a social and cultural historian of the 20th century and a professor of history at NYU and CUNY. He's also the host of the Nostalgia Trap, a podcast that features his engaging interviews with historians, academics, and activists, in which he and his guests explore the social, political, and cultural history of the past several decades. You can find episodes of the Nostalgia Trap at nostalgiatrap.com. Welcome to the Soapbox, David.
Thanks so much for having me, Eric. I appreciate it.
So these conversations on your show, David, it's a great podcast. I'm thrilled to have you on the show here on the Soapbox, and they generally, I think it's pretty safe to say, fall on the left side of the ideological spectrum. And so I've often...
So far, that's true, yes.
So I've often heard you talk to your guests about their process of radicalization, and I'm curious, how was it that you yourself became radicalized, if you would say that you have, and what does that term even really mean to you?
Yeah, I guess that's a long story. In part, I feel like I started this podcast as a way to explore kind of the landmarks along my, or the signposts of radicalization along my own way. Mm-hmm. So I think a lot of it for me stems from growing up in a fairly homogenous small white suburb in Southern California that was kind of known for its conservative values, particularly during the era that I was growing up, which was the kind of 80s and 90s. And I feel like Ventura, California, which is the place where I'm from, it's grown a lot in the last few decades for sure. But part of it, I think, was just growing up in an environment of extreme conservatism and falling into that myself. I mean, in high school, and this is somewhat of a source of embarrassment for me, but in high school, I think as hypnotized by Rush Limbaugh and others as a lot of my colleagues in high school, and it took actually starting to go to college to figure out how wrong I was to kind of fall into any of that thinking. But I think that my experience going to UCSB, which is Santa Barbara, a big public research university, that place is known for its kind of there was a kind of left liberal thing going on among the professors in the history department there. And I would say, it's a combination of both, an academic kind of learning about history and learning about politics and kind of falling over to the left over the years, but also just my own experience of kind of watching the society around us and kind of understanding how politics were moving. It took me a while to kind of put all that together.
So, David, what was it that you would say that you got? I mean, it could appear, based on what you just said, that your turn to the left was just, again, a product of the environment in which you found yourself. So, but what was it that clicked for you that you got that you hadn't gotten before, and what was the appeal of the conservative, movement that you fell prey to before?
Well, if I felt, I honestly, I've done a lot of thinking about that. In terms of like psychology, I think in part, I've been reading, this great series of books by Rick Perlstein. One of them, probably the bestseller, is Nixonland, where he kind of lays out this theory of the right, in which the right has succeeded in some respects by painting themselves as outsiders and painting themselves as kind of these alienated, victimized outsiders. And I felt like that when I was young, because I was an outsider myself. And I went to a very kind of, as much as the conservative movement was around me, my high school was filled with kind of like elite white liberal kids. And I didn't fit in among them at all. And I think adopted some of that language in part just because of my own alienation and resentment. But in terms of coming to the other side, I mean, for me, I think that race is a huge part of that. And coming to terms with the racism in American society, not only today, but the history of racism in American society, and realizing that the conservative movement that I was identifying with was not only a part of that, but driving that. Those were big moments. And I mean, in high school, I do remember, and I've told this story in the podcast before, in high school I was in high school during the Prop 187 fight, which if those that aren't from Southern California or California might not remember, but it was Prop 187 was a bill that concerned taking away welfare benefits from illegal immigrants. And it was one of the first major bills that was kind of attacking immigrants and brought out a lot of really, really ugly stuff within my community and in my high school. I remember watching football players burning a Mexican flag during lunchtime on my campus. And, it was moments like that where I was so sickened, and I think it was part of me understanding a little bit more about kind of what the movement was and what these movements were about. And I would say that, race all the way through, taking Black Studies courses in college were also formative moments for me, where I kind of realized a lot more of what was going on in the world and in history.
It's interesting that you would say that. I've noticed that a number of the guests on the Nostalgia Trap also seem to have been radicalized a generation earlier during the civil rights movement. Do you see a parallel there?
Yeah, definitely. And I was just talking to as a professor who would be an episode upcoming about that moment. When I was a teenager in the early 1990s and mid 90s of the LA riots, and the LA riots were a very kind of awakening moment for all of us. I was definitely too young. I think I was like 13 when the LA riots happened. I was definitely too young to really grasp a lot of the kind of complex streams of racial history that were being expressed at that moment. But as I got older, I began thinking about that and realizing that there was a kind of really ugly discussion of race happening in the 1990s, and I'm not. I don't know about a parallel to the civil rights movement in the sense that, there was activism going on. I wasn't a part of it. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, I feel like it was a part of a larger conversation. I mean, this was a really ugly moment in the 90s where people were talking about affirmative action. People were talking about Clinton cutting welfare. This was the building of the prison industrial system. So all of those conversations were conversations that I was hearing and picking up on, whether I was involved in any activism or not. It was more a sense of just understanding that this was a big problem in the society and one that was worthy of thinking about.
It's interesting. I think we're roughly the same age. I might be a couple of years behind you, but I grew up in Maine, which is very white, one of the whitest states in America.
Yep.
And so I would say I never really flirted with the conservative side of things, but and race has always been present in my mind as an injustice. But it's not been. I haven't experienced it on quite the visceral level that maybe I would have if I had spent more time in more sort of urban centers. And so, to my mind, there have been a series of incidences that have occurred that I think have led to the leftward tilt of our generation. Beginning arguably, although I think you can kind of keep tracing this back as far as you want to go, but I think beginning with the 2000 election. And I'm curious, how politically active were you at that time, and what impact did that have?
Well, I would describe. I had just graduated college in 2000, June of 2000. I went on a long road trip with a friend. We were doing kind of like a Jack Kerouac kind of on the road thing. And as we were out there, the election was happening, and Bush was the Republican nominee, as I recall, and we were actually in Washington D.C. just happened to be randomly there during the night of the election. And so it's kind of like in a very kind of, I don't know, self-exploratory phase, I guess. But the Bush versus Gore Supreme Court decision, I think I call back to that a lot on the show as a enormously, I don't know, a demoralizing moment is one way of putting it. I think it has been for a lot of, or was for a lot of young people to see the election be, it's hard to describe what happened. I think for a long time it was described as just stolen. But at the same time, it just felt like we didn't have a strong handle on democracy in America. And that combined with 9/11, both of those events I think were big events for me in terms of realizing that I didn't know everything. In fact, I knew very, very little. I was not politically active at the moment, but I was definitely I would describe myself as on the left. Mm-hmm. But 9/11 combined with the Bush administration's immediate response to it really created a lot of tension between me and my friends about kind of what was what were the appropriate responses to 9/11. And it was a kind of a shattering moment, I would say, and a defining moment between me and my friends from college, and realizing that I felt much more radical than they did about what was happening, and much more I think much more fearsome or fearful about what was happening, and not in a way of like fearing terrorism, but more kind of understanding that this was a enormously important moment for the state and how the state was going to respond, and enormously important moment for the world and how the United States was going to kind of engage with it. So that's when it was right after 9/11 that I felt like I knew nothing about American history. I started, and I had already graduated from college. I was just living in Los Angeles trying to figure out my next steps and tried to work temp jobs and things like that. And anyway, I started picking up books on my own and feeling like I needed to educate myself beyond what I had learned in college. And that's when I think I came to starting to read like Howard Zinn, Noam Chomsky, the usual suspects of the kind of left indoctrination. But that's when I started, I think, accelerating a lot of kind of my own attitudes towards American history, and realizing that I wanted to go to graduate school to study it.
Well, okay, so let's speak historically of America's sort of tenuous relationship with democracy. You mentioned it in referring to the 2000 election, and we're seeing it even now in the 2016 presidential election, right? On both sides of the aisle, the Republicans are actively campaigning to go to a contested convention where party brokers can essentially overthrow the democratically expressed will of the people and take the nomination away from Trump. But then also with Sanders, all of the mainstream media insist on including the superdelegates in the delegate count when they compare delegate counts between Clinton and Sanders. Really kind of failing to acknowledge a few things. One, that there is historical precedent, even in 2008 with Hillary Clinton, of superdelegates sort of switching sides when the political winds blow that way.
That's right.
But also sort of implicitly going along with this idea that the Democratic Party would overturn the will of their own electorate, their own constituents, by using the superdelegates to alter the result of the primary process. So, what is your sense of where we find ourselves now? Has this been a charade that we've been living under all along, and we that's the wool is just coming, the curtain's coming down now, or what is your sense?
It's funny because I just started recording new episodes of the podcast and talking to people, and that's pretty much all we've been talking about is trying to unpack this primary season and figure out what's going on, because it seems like there are obviously multiple possible narratives and scenarios, and feeling like I'm not sure exactly what's going on, but at the same time, in a general sense, I think what you said is correct in the sense that the constituents on both sides, whether they be the Democrats or Republicans, feel like they are being manipulated, and that's a big driver of the politics right now. And in a lot of ways, what you just said about kind of the wool being pulled over and now perhaps being pulled off is, I feel like if there's anything that Trump is accomplishing, he is kind of accomplishing this kind of like displaying the election as a stage managed cartoon. He's kind of showing what it's been for a long time, and in a lot of ways he's kind of revealing how crass and stage managed it's been for many election cycles now. And I think a lot of people know that. A lot of people know that in some way what this all means is that the people the citizens of the United States don't really get to decide who the president is, and even when they do, the policies that president enacts are often totally separate from what we would describe as the will of the people.
Yeah, is it your sense that, I have to admit, Trump, he frightens me, but there is something sort of giddily cathartic about watching him sort of overturn these expectations and standards that we've just been living by. Do you think Trump is even conscious of the fact or the degree to which his support is almost a protest a protest at the system as it's existed. Do you think that that's at all accurate?
It's hard to sense if that's what people that are voting for him are actually intending to express, and B, how aware of that is he? I mean, and I think it's right to first point out I think Trump's an insane monster, but at the same time I think you're right. There is something, if there is a giddy excitement about watching him, it's an excitement at seeing something changing or something being destroyed or something happening that's going to break this kind of like political malaise, deadlock, whatever you want to call it, the broken kind of political system that we have. There's where the excitement is. It's almost like finally something is happening, and in that sense, like I feel like there is a kind of like punk rock element to it. Maybe I'm reading this totally the wrong way. But it feels like the vote for Donald Trump is a vote to destroy whatever your belief in the quote unquote establishment, whatever that might be. Mm-hmm. What is it? I mean, it's populism in a classic sense, and populism has often come with some really ugly, racist, nativist elements. In a lot of ways, I feel like Donald Trump is not that new a phenomenon. It actually seems more like a 19th century politician than any other. But yeah, the energies that are being released by this election are tricky, I think, for sure.
Well, so are we witnessing, to your mind, a realignment of the political parties here? I mean, have the Democrats so taken for granted the working class vote and support that now they're finding comfort with Trump? And I mean, Thomas Frank just wrote this article in the Guardian about how it may not just be racism that is fueling his support. Mm-hmm. He speaks a lot about trade and really rails against these free trade deals, which have been disastrous for the working class. Are we seeing a mass shift in a political realignment in the parties?
Well, I mean, it's hard to say. I mean, I think that whatever we're seeing is definitely being viewed as a crisis within both parties. It's almost like the Trump and maybe Bernie Sanders a little bit too have kind of knocked them off script a little bit. The other day when watching the GOP debate, what little I could stomach was Trump, kind of standing apart from everyone and distinguishing himself by saying, I'm the only candidate on this stage that didn't support the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is a new Obama's free trade deal, and he got huge applause for that, and it felt like, wow, when I was younger, talking about free trade, talking about NAFTA, I mean, you were just kind of like barking into an empty chamber there. I mean, free trade was something that was definitely something that the left was talking about. Mm-hmm. I remember NAFTA being the subject of obviously a lot of debate in the 90s. But either way, to see that issue become kind of universally derided by the working class on both the left and the right is really kind of another moment that I think you're right is locating something changing, something stirring. I don't know what that will be, and I don't know how this will evolve, but at the same time, I think that a lot of Americans have figured out that they're being ripped off, and especially younger Americans. But in a lot of ways, you can look at this election as a result of the last 8 years since the economic collapse in 2008. Things have not gotten better, and most Americans, I think, are starting to become aware of that and starting to realize that both parties have a lot to answer for the policies they've created that have continued the really horrific economic situation we find ourselves in.
Yeah, and as you sort of alluded to, there's a huge generational divide, particularly in the Democratic Party right now, between support for Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton. And I think that's really telling. I mean, as being a member technically of this millennial generation myself, I see it. I witness it, between myself and my parents' generation. And I feel like we're so often, the support for Sanders is so often sort of derided as idealistic, youthful indulgence, which I think may have been true about Obama, because there really wasn't as much substance there as there is with Sanders, and Sanders is a flawed candidate as well. But I think more now what we're seeing is an entire generation that has grown up in the detritus of neoliberalism. And
that's exactly right.
Right, and we're recognizing the utter and abysmal failure of capitalism, and we're feeling it. Even when people might not articulate it in those words, I think they're feeling it, and they're seeing Sanders as an alternative, and even to a certain extent Trump, but he's appealing to a different sort of inclination, I think, in the populace.
Yeah, I agree, and in that sense, the impulses are similar in the sense that both Trump voters and Sanders voters, I think, if there's anything that joins them, it's the feeling that there needs to be a massive shift in the way power works in the country, and feeling like personally ripped off, I think is a very kind of powerful driver of political anger. And when I think about myself, like kind of coming of age in the 90s and entering the job market in the 90s, the job market was a lot better in the 1990s. Like I became radicalized during a good economy, in a sense, right? Like I became radicalized by reading Noam Chomsky and Howard Zinn and things like that. I feel like younger people, this millennial generation, or however you want to classify them, they've had much more of kind of a lived experience of the economy, right? So much more of the lived experience of graduating from college with a lot of debt into a job market that's not going to provide the money to pay off those debts. That's like enormously, I can't describe the matrix of emotions that creates, but I'm really interested in that. I mean, that's part of what I try to do with the podcast, is kind of mix that kind of personal, that kind of personal relationship to the larger politics, because I feel like if there's anything different about the Sanders voters, the young voters, it's because it's not ideological or idealistic, or a fantasy. It's instead policies that they want to remedy the problems that they are actually feeling. And I think that's a really important and maybe dangerous moment for the Democrats, because they have an army of very, very angry people who kind of know that they know who have the people that have put these policies in place, and a lot of them know that Hillary Clinton was kind of an instrumental figure in a lot of these things.
Well, and the sort of obtuseness of the elites in the Democratic Party is sort of astonishing to me, because they see these generational divides as much as we do, right? So they have to see the direction that the party is so obviously going, and yet they're resisting and they're resisting. It feels to me like this is sort of the last ditch effort to maintain power as it has existed. But it seems inevitable, does it not, that this generational movement is poised to take the reins and to do with it what they will. I'm not sure what it will be exactly, but...
Well, I mean, on the one sense, I could say that, but then I remember a generation called baby boomers that were ready to take the reins in the 1968 election. The Democratic Party was going to collapse over this energy, but a lot of those baby boomers ended up, folding themselves into the establishment.
So, how did that happen, David? You study history? How did that happen?
How did that happen? Well, I mean, there are a lot of different elements going on, but I think in part it's just people getting older. I mean, this was like what happened in the 1960s with the generation we call baby boomers is, well, first of all, it's not a monolithic group of people, so it's hard to say, but make kind of to make general statements about them. But at the same time, I feel like the 1960s were a moment where a lot of young white middle class kids discovered a kind of counterculture lifestyle, and that rebellion, that political rebellion, mixed in with a lot of other things that were going on, including the civil rights movement and the Vietnam War, etc. But the Vietnam War ended. The civil rights movement was both crushed by the FBI and turned into and evolved into a lot of different cultural things in the 70s. I think people moved on, and ultimately, the cliche is of so many of the leaders. I think like Jerry Rubin that went on to work on Wall Street, and brought that kind of like ponytail thing to Wall Street. I mean, if you look at the 1970s, all the Wall Street finance guys had ponytails and beards, and you see that today a little bit in both what we call like the tech bro. And the finance traders, they all are looking like they're on their way to, Coachella or something like that. There is a kind of like this cultural thing going on that maybe has nothing to do with politics. But I don't know. That's a good question. It's a long evolution. But either way, I think it's important to realize that a lot of the young people that are idealistic now may change their minds eventually and become neoliberal. But it does feel like a different moment. It does feel like something is stirring about, in particular, the big issues like education, employment, healthcare. Those are turns that are happening very, very quickly and very powerfully among young people. So I'm hoping, that as we move forward in this economy, that most young people can't really find a leg up in, that energy will continue.